All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. This is the 8th webinar in the National Alliance to End Homelessness's Emergency Shelter Learning Series, webinar series. So thank you all so much for joining us for today's topic about increasing access to emergency shelter, HUD's Equal Access Rule. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. If you've been on a webinar before with us, this should look familiar. We have about 800 of you all registered today for the webinar, so thank you so much to all of you for joining. But that means that in order to sort of limit the chatter on the lines, everybody is placed on mute. But that does not mean we don't want to hear from you. If you look to the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a little toolbar box from GoToWebinar that has a lot of different options. The ones that I want to point out to you especially are the Ask a Question box. So we will have ample time throughout the webinar as well as at the end of it today for you to ask questions. So as you have questions, clarifications, things you want to share, please do put those into the question box and we will get to as many of them as we are able to during the webinar today. Below the question box, you will also see section titled Handouts. We have 4 handouts today. 3 excellent tools that were developed when the Equal Access was launched, and so those are still available on different sites, and we have them here for you today. So please feel free to download those tools and use them as you are able. We also have the slides available for download over there today, so you can follow along if you want, and save those and share them after the webinar. We are recording the webinar, and the recording and the slides will be sent out to all of you who registered, as well as posted on the National Alliance's website following the presentation. So again, feel free to share this far and wide with whoever would benefit from the content. So my name is Ben Cattell-Knoll. I am a technical assistant specialist with the National Alliance to End Homelessness Center for Capacity Building. I will just be giving some brief comments to kick off the webinar today and handling the questions as they come in. But we are very, very happy to be joined today by Abby Miller and David Canavan. Abby is with the SNAPS office at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and David is a technical assistance provider for the SNAPS office. So they will tell you more about themselves and introduce themselves in just a minute, but we are very, very grateful to be joined by them today to hear more about HUD's Equal Access recommendations. So the Emergency Shelter Learning Series, as I mentioned, this is the 8th webinar in this series. The Shelter Learning Series, in addition to the webinars, we also have a series of infographics, self-assessments, data metrics, blog posts, and a wealth of other resources that you can access on our website. You can see the link there below, endhomelessness.org/resource/emergency shelter, where you can locate all the previous webinars and all the infographics and tools. We developed this series because for a long time there were few to no resources out there for emergency shelters, and we wanted to help change that. So we developed this series and these resources as a way to help achieve 4 key goals. First, to help you strengthen your shelter policies and the services that you provide to people experiencing homelessness in your community so that you can help more folks exit your homelessness system into housing across your system. We also want to help implement a system-wide approach to ending homelessness that includes emergency shelters. For too long, shelters were not involved in some of the community planning and being a part of the process of ending homelessness. So we want to help you do that better. We also want to help you align the goals of your shelter with your community's goals to end homelessness and be more actively involved. And we also want to help you provide low barrier, safe, and housing-focused shelter. As we developed the Shelter Learning Series, we reached out to shelters across the country who were very effective in helping people exit homelessness, in providing a safe shelter environment that was accessible to all people. And so we developed, out of those conversations, we developed the 5 keys to effective emergency shelter. This infographic is available for download on the website. and just wanted to put it up here again for you all to see, and just to briefly mention the 5 keys. A housing-first approach, safe and appropriate diversion, immediate and low barrier access, housing-focused rapid exit services, and data to measure performance. So if you go to our website, you can find tools, resources, and webinars on all of these topics, and we will continue to dive deeper into some of these over the course of the Shelter Learning Series. Where we're going to spend most of our time today is on the topic of immediate and low barrier access. So what that means for our context today is that a shelter can serve households of any configuration. This includes couples without children. It includes persons who identify as LGBTQ. It includes 2-parent households. It includes mothers with teen boys. It includes a variety of additional configurations of households. We want to make sure that shelter is accessible to anybody who needs it, no matter what their household looks like. When we talk about immediate and low barrier access, we're also talking about the ability to serve folks who may be using substances or have a mental illness, a mental health diagnosis, regardless of their treatment compliance. We're also talking about configuring your shelter space so that it can serve different configurations of households, different size families, that it can accommodate people with special or unique needs who need to access your shelter. And so today, we're going to focus on HUD's equal access rule that was implemented several years ago, and talk about how it impacts your shelter operations and your shelter's policies. We're also going to talk about how HUD's equal access rule can help us provide better low barrier access to people who need shelter. So that's an overview of where we're headed today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Abby and David, who can introduce themselves and take us through their agenda for the day. So Abby, David, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ben. This is Abby Miller from the SNAPS office. I am going to kick us off and then turn it over to David, who's going to take us into the agenda and just some level setting of terms that we'll be using throughout that we want to make sure that everyone's on the same page, because sometimes when this particular issue is new to you, we believe starting with the terminology is a really great place. But just to briefly introduce myself, I have been at HUD for 6 years, and I've been in the SNAPS office for 4, and really focused on actually a lot of performance measurement and thinking about how to improve our systems, the entire system of care. And it's really, I think, where I come from on a lot of this work. But the equal access rule is a really particular cut at, how we improve a system of care across the entirety of it. And it's really focused in the same way that our office is focused on coordinated entry. Our office is focused on using housing first approaches, lowering barriers to all of the projects that we offer. And the idea is the same with all of them. It is, in the words of Anne Oliva, we must serve the people who show up, not the people who we think are going to show up, but the people who are in front of us who are experiencing homelessness. They are the ones who need the services and the housing that we have to offer. And it's our job to figure out how to get that to them. So I think it's always helpful to contextualize, but in particular, I think the equal access rule has offered some challenging material for some folks, and I think it's really helpful to keep it in the context of this is all about opening our systems more to the people who need it, serving the most vulnerable people first, and getting as many people housed as quickly as we can. So today we're going to talk about a set of 2 rules, one published in 2012, one published in 2016. But I ask that you hold all of this information in that broader context. David, do you want to introduce yourself and walk us through the agenda in terms?
Thanks, Abby. As Abby mentioned, my name is David Canavan. I have been a technical assistance provider to the SNAPS office for about 15 years. I worked on a bunch of different issues, one of which, like Abby, is around data and access. I have done a lot of HMIS work. I also work on disasters and how, when communities experience surges in homelessness, how do we adjust operations and move pieces around. And I think, like Abby mentioned, I draw a lot of my direction from that idea that we have to serve the people who are homeless in order to end homelessness. And that unfortunately means that we see in the homeless community individuals and households in our larger communities that experience institutionalized bias, disadvantages, and that emerges in a lot of different ways. And I spent the last 2 days at a 500-bed emergency shelter talking with them. And a few weeks ago, I was in front of a group of folks in Louisiana, and I had the opportunity to really talk with some folks, and I think it really reminded me how much about what we do is about conveying respect. And so Abby mentioned we're going to start with conveying respect, about how to convey respect. If we look at the agenda on the next slide, you should see we'll start there, and we'll move then into the discussion around the equal access rule itself. What does it mean? What is compliance? Kind of the background. And then we want to talk about some specific scenarios at projects that have occurred. One of the interesting, having worked on this topic for 4 or 5 years now, one of the interesting components that's come up for me is that people very much need to ask their specific question in order to feel like there is an understanding of the complexity and nuance of what they do. And I hear that. I know, we make a lot of decisions at the project level as project administrators, as frontline staff, and many times it doesn't feel like the actual nuance or the actual complexity or urgency of our job in that role is understood by folks in DC, at National Advocacy Org. Like, there's a lot that goes into that job. And so part of why Abby and I are here today, and part of why I think HUD has made an investment in a lot of these types of activities, is so that you have the opportunity to ask your question. And so I know Ben mentioned in our opening to use that chat function or the ask a question function, but if you've sat down at this webinar with a burning question and it starts to feel like you're going to get up from this webinar without getting that question answered, please, please, please ask it. It's critically important. And if you walk away with that same question, then we've really not done a great job as a team of meeting the goal of getting those questions answered. So, and then finally, we'll look at the resources. What else is out there to help you? Ben mentioned that when the equal access rule was first implemented, when the gender identity rule was first implemented, there were a variety of technical assistance materials published. Those materials are available here, and I understand the National Alliance will make them available on their website, so that's great. There are also lots of resources in the community, and as we get to the end of the slides, we have plugged in many of those resources available to you. We won't probably get to the full slideshow, but we did, as Ben mentioned, since they'll be published, wanted to make sure that they're there. So let's go ahead and start with language, because I think that that's a critical component of having these conversations. It is the most important part of working, or my experience at least, one of the most important parts of working at the emergency shelter level with residents, with guests, is to convey respect. And how we do that is how we are perceived to be respectful is important. And one of the questions that I get often in the field is, I just don't know what word to use, or I made a mistake and I used the wrong pronoun for somebody, and I don't know how to recover from that. And it so disrupts our ability to form a rapport or communicate that there's no way to kind of salvage that particular interaction. So before we get started with the nuance of the rule and the complexity, I wanted to start with some very basic terminology and get everybody on the same page. So gender identity is an individual's internal sense of being male, female, or another gender. As we come to kind of understand more about gender, we understand that there are individuals who don't align with either end, male and female, of the gender spectrum, and that there are spots in the middle of that spectrum. And gender identity is that internal sense, and that may or may not match the sex that's assigned at birth, that the anatomy of an individual's body can be divergent from an individual's internal sense of their gender. Separate and apart from that internal sense is how we choose to express our gender. And this is where a lot of things around stereotyping come into play, particularly with this rule and other elements of non-discrimination requirements. That because somebody is perceived to be female or to be male, we as a community have an expectation that that individual will behave in a certain way, that their hair will be styled in a particular way, that they will or will not wear dresses, that they will or will not have a certain intonation to their voice. And when our expectations conflict with an individual's actual expression is when we get the friction, the complication. And so part of the choice that some people make is to not express that gender because they don't feel safe to do so, or they have concerns around access to resources. But that ability to express one's gender is separate from their gender identity. Separate from both of those features is sexual orientation. And this is our physical and emotional attraction to other people and where that is oriented in the world. These are, all of the science that we have access to indicates that these are not connected. These are, your gender identity, gender expression is not necessarily connected to your sexual orientation. And so while these components are linked in our presentation today and in the rule, because often, again, as we look at marginalized community and how individuals who are in marginalized communities are the victims of systemic bias, often this group is treated in a similar way. Moving on, the next term I wanted to touch on is transgender. And this is the overarching term that's used by the community to describe an individual whose internal sense of who they are, their gender, is different from their sex that was assigned at the time that they were born. And being transgender or having a transgender identity it's really up to that individual to disclose, and there are members of that community that once their internal sense of gender identity and their external expression, their gender expression, are in alignment, they no longer define themselves as transgender. And so going back to that idea that really being respectful and conveying respect is the critical, excuse me, I'm sorry, I have a bit of a cold, is the critical component of how we work with folks, and having that respect be embedded in every one of our interactions and all of our printed materials and how we interact with folks. The last phrase on this slide is transitioning. And this is the idea again, as we talk about somebody's internal sense and their external expression coming into alignment, this idea of transitioning is the phrase that's used to describe that. There are individuals who don't go through that process, who have an internal sense of their gender, but choose to not transition for a variety of reasons, some of which, may have to do with how they may be treated, family choices, a variety of complicated factors. Really important to understand is that transitioning does not require medical treatment. For many, many individuals, transitioning is much more about how they are perceived in those elements that comprise gender expression: hairstyle, clothes, voice, those ways that we recognize and denote gender. That is often, for many people, that is the route that they choose to go. And medical treatment is not a part of that process. And so you'll hear Abby and I talk quite a bit today about the best and sole source of an individual's gender is the individual. That we are not in the business of checking somebody's anatomy and determining whether they can come into this homeless shelter or not. And that really is based in much of this and the conveying that respect. So I'd like to move us into our first poll because it's really interesting to me. This is one of the opportunities I have to interact with the most amount of people at a single time, is hearing whether these are new terms for you or whether you've used these terms before, but they're not part of your regular interactions with in your community, or maybe this is a daily part of your project and the service delivery. So Ben, could you go ahead and launch that poll?
All right, you should all be seeing it now. And it looks like, yep, we got some folks starting to vote already. About 50% of you all voted, so leave this open for about another 10 seconds and see if we can get some more. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and you should see the results pop up shortly here.
That's great. So it really looks like for many of you, for most of you, these are terms that you're at least familiar with, and the majority of you, these are terms that you use regularly. That's really great. This poll looked very different when we started our initial rollout of this policy. So it's nice to see that everybody's able to convey the respect that I know we all feel when we engage in this work. Abby, can I turn it over to you now that we've done the language stuff and you can dive into the rule?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. So I want to start with just a little bit of a history. I promise it'll be short, but a history of the Equal Access Rule in 2012 and then the 2016 Gender Identity Rule. So I'm not going to go into these a lot because as we go through the scenarios, we found that this is really how you learn how this rule applies to your particular project. But it's helpful to just go over the requirements. So in 2012, HUD published the Equal Access Rule that said across all HUD-funded programs, housing, shelter, whatever, all of them, that equal access had to be granted to anybody regardless of sexual orientation, marital status, or gender identity. But in 2012, there was one area that we were still seeking more research, more policy input on, and that was how we would admit and place trans folks in single-sex projects. So often shelters, but as we allow for in the COC interim rule, that these are places where you have either shared bathrooms, meaning there's like multiple stalls or multiple shower stalls, or shared living arrangements like a bedroom, but not places where there's a common living room and there's a bathroom that multiple people use, but you can lock it every time. That's not shared. We're talking shared is really like when there's some expectation of privacy. That in those sorts of projects, that we needed to make policy on how those projects were to admit and serve trans folks. Really how to admit everyone, but the people who were being barred from those environments or inappropriately placed were often transgender folks. So the 2016 rule then clarified this last point and set the requirement that everyone who comes to shelter or who comes to any single-sex facility or environment must be placed in accordance with the gender identity that that person holds for themselves. Not their gender expression that you as an intake staff might read as a particular gender, but their self-reported gender identity. And the reason why we focus on the self-reported, and there is also a prohibition from asking additional probing questions. You can't ask about anatomy. You cannot ask for somebody to show you an ID that quote unquote proves that they're a particular gender. And we prohibited those for very important reasons. One is, and we all know that people experiencing homelessness do not have access to a lot of resources. And the same holds true for people whose gender identity does not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. Also, when they're experiencing homelessness, do not have access to a lot of resources. So hormones, surgery, other modifications that people might make to their appearance may not be available, also may not be of interest. But it makes it harder for that person to perhaps present in the way that they would like to. And that includes, in a big way, having IDs that reflect one's gender identity. IDs are governed by state laws. They are different across the US. And so there's no guarantee that somebody is going to be able to get identification documents that reflect their gender identity. And so the main point is, with this rule, we're trying to eliminate common sources of inappropriate placements, which can be somebody's assumptions about what somebody looks like David was talking about, or a reliance on IDs to prove something that IDs are not going to prove. So it's really about getting rid of the barriers that don't need to be there so that we can serve people quickly and more easily and appropriately. And then there's one last requirement that I want to point out in the 2016 gender identity rule that is about projects have to take non-discriminatory steps to address clients' privacy concerns. And this really manifests in one way that we've seen a lot, where there are a lot of projects that have said, well, okay, so maybe other people don't feel comfortable with transgender clients, and so we're going to create a separate room that they have to stay in. That is segregating somebody when they haven't asked to be segregated. And so what we have set as a requirement in the rule is that if somebody comes to you, transgender or not, if somebody comes to you in your project and says, I feel that I need more privacy for X, Y, or Z reason, the reason doesn't really matter, but that You then take non-discriminatory steps to address those privacy concerns. And you'll see as we go through the scenarios that can take different forms. But the important part is that you're not doing it as a shelter policy to say, well, if you are X, then Y will happen. But you're being responsive to people's needs. The last requirement here that I will point out is just the last bullet. Providers have to update your policies and procedures to reflect these requirements. And that's simply making sure it's codified. So why are these equal access protections necessary? I just want to put a few statistics out there for you and some of the ones that moved us to set further requirements. Among homeless LGBT youth, the average age that they become homeless for the first time is 15 years old. 15. So there's obviously something systemic happening before people show up to shelter. There is a lot of family rejection. There are a lot of things that have occurred, and it's happening earlier and earlier. We also know from a Center for American Progress study that was done, I believe in 2015, but they studied across 4 states. 2 of the states had anti-discrimination policies at the state level, and 2 did not. Regardless of that, the shelters that were in the study, 2/3 of the time did not enroll a caller. So somebody called and said, I need a bed. And after revealing her transgender status, whoever was on the other end of the line, whether it was a shelter intake staff or whether it was a coordinated entry staff, 2/3 of the time they did not house people properly. And finally, the worst statistic I think for us to think about and take in is that homeless transgender residents who have actually gone into shelter, nearly a quarter of them are assaulted by other residents or even staff. And so we have some room to move forward. We have a lot of room to move forward, and we have very concrete reasons that we need to do so. So to answer, if you go to the next slide, the question of, is your project required to comply with the equal access rules? And so that covers the 2012 and the 2016. Any HUD program, if you receive HUD funding, then the equal access rule applies to you. The 2016 rule is specifically about gender identity in single-sex environments. But if you receive any of the sources of funding listed on this slide, then the 2016 gender identity rule also applies to you. And keep in mind the 2012 equal access rule that says equal access for all, regardless of marital status, gender identity, or sexual orientation. That applies to all HUD programs. So with that, I will turn it over to David and see what questions have come in.
Yeah, so this is Ben. I'll jump in real quick. It does look like there's a few questions that have come in, which we'll pose now. So one question says, if an individual identifies as one gender but chooses not to use the shelter for that gender, so if they identify as a male but don't feel comfortable using the male shelter, what is the next step for that person or within that system?
So just to be clear on the question, it is if an individual who identifies as male comes to a shelter that serves men, but is not, for for whatever reason, doesn't feel comfortable enrolling in that project. Is that then what I'm understanding?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that maybe we could use this opportunity to talk a little bit about comfort versus rights, because I think comfort is something that comes up often in these conversations. As you know, this particular person will make somebody uncomfortable. This will create an awkward situation. And HUD thought a lot about, and Abby, jump in here if you want to speak in more detail about it, but HUD thought a lot about the gender identity rule before it published it. It came 4 years after the equal access rule itself. It had lots of public comment around it. And so once everybody kind of had their opportunity to weigh in, it really became evident that people want to have and need to have the option for single-sex projects. And part of that idea of being comfortable is different and apart from how we encourage and sustain safety and certain basic components of a project. And so if an individual who is eligible for a service and is offered an opportunity to enroll but doesn't feel comfortable for that, I think at a very operational level, I would really want to know why. That would probably be my first move as a frontline worker, to talk about, what's going on, what's making you uncomfortable. If I were a COC coordinator or a collaborative applicant, I might want to understand if there were pieces of that project that weren't creating that low barrier design that HUD has really supported in the last many years. And so I think those would probably be the first 2 places I would go, because I would want to understand better the situation. But I'm not sure that clearly answers your question. Abby, is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Well, I may be reading into part of this, so apologies if I am, and this isn't what you meant, but we have had a question come in from a number of people about if somebody, so in this case, the client or potential client identifies as a man, but potentially that person's sex assigned at birth is female, do they have the option? Does he have the option to then go to the women's shelter? And that is one thing that we are clear about in the rule, that is not an option. We have to require that everyone is placed in accordance with their gender identity and not advantage some folks over others. What that does create is, like David pointed to, a source of discomfort. And that discomfort is something that we need to work through. We need to question and be open to figuring out how to change our projects so that they can be more responsive to people's needs. But there is an element of discomfort for usually at least one person in these situations. And I think that's just something that we need to be okay with, and be okay with asking why and doing the best that we can. But knowing that somebody has to be placed in accordance with that person's gender identity.
Great, thanks. There's a lot of questions coming in now. Trying to combine a couple of these and see if I can ask them in a specific way. So there's some questions coming in looking for clarification around shelters that serve just a single sex, that are either a male shelter or a female shelter. Just some clarifications as to whether or not that is allowable, but also some questions about what do you do, or have you worked with shelters that serve both men and women in the same space, and are there any unique things to take into account in regards to equal access if a shelter is serving both men and women?
That's a great question. Yes. So there are lots of projects that serve men and women, and I think that the exception or the standard that is set in the gender identity rule that permits a single-sex environment is pretty clear. It has to have shared bathing or shared sleeping facilities. It has to be a single facility, so a single building. Think of it like a gymnasium or a community center, or that you don't have the option of moving people between multiple buildings. Sorry, I'm not quite fast enough on the mute button to avoid the coughing. I apologize. So those standards, and those are HUD standards around emergency shelter. You perhaps could host folks from the Department of Justice around VAWA standards, or from HHS around HHS standards, but in general, they all fall into the same neighborhood. And so if a project is permitted to be single gender, it doesn't mean it must be single gender. And I have been at projects where the sleeping arrangements are a congregate setting where there are bunk beds, and the bathrooms are not configured in a way where you have multiple people showering at the same time with no privacy, which often tends to be one of the main points of concern. And they have opted to continue to serve men and women in that environment, that they have the sense that they're able to sustain safety, that the community they create within that shelter is about respect, and that the particular way they're sustaining their project is able to manage the two different communities, two different populations in the same space safely and respectfully. Abby, you're good at picking up on the nuance if I missed something. Is there a piece to that I missed, or you want to add anything?
Well, I think Ben's question, there may have been also something inherent in there about when you're permitted to have a single gender or single sex, and we'll use those interchangeably, but a single gender project. And I think if folks would like more clarification on what shared means, I'll say again, shared indicates that more than one person is inside the space at the same time, and that's how it's designed to be. That doesn't mean, as David was just saying, that you can't figure out like ways to, have shower schedules or what have you. There are ways to modify the spaces, but the physical layout of quote unquote shared, what that means is that more than one person is like expected to occupy that space at the same time. And so if you don't have that, then the project you have does not fall within this single gender carve out.
Gotcha.
And Abby, as you were talking, one piece that I didn't mention, and we'll dig into a little bit more later, but it must only be for adults.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah. That you cannot have a project that serves children be single gender. That is never a constellation of services that is permissible with HUD funding.
That's right. And I'll draw the picture for you. If you serve families with children, so if you serve families with children, you are required to serve all families with children. You can't dictate that only families with a particular gender as the head of household, or only families with a particular gender of children are permitted. If you serve families, we require that you serve all families. And so this talk of single gender, single sex is very much limited to adult shelters only, or adult facilities. Thank you, David.
Thanks. Yeah, so one quick follow-up, and I mean, we have a million questions coming in, and we'll get to as many as we can, but I do want to let you all move on because I think some of these will probably be answered in some of the other slides you all have. But just a quick follow-up to that. So there was a question that came in around whether or not you can have a shelter that exclusively serves youth who identify as LGBTQ. Is that permissible under equal access, or do you have to serve all youth regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation?
That is a really good question. David, did you want to start?
No, go ahead, Dan.
Okay. So projects are not permitted to limit to a particular population. You cannot limit your shelter to straight young people. You also cannot limit your shelter to lesbian, gay, or bisexual young people. You can't limit your shelter to transgender young people. But what you can do is create an inclusive, welcoming environment and offer services that are culturally competent, that are very responsive to people's needs around grappling with their gender identity, grappling with their sexual orientation. And then anybody who feels that they would benefit from those services has to be, if otherwise eligible, if they want to be there and there's a vacant bed, then that person can go there. And so we often talk about this in terms of targeting versus limiting. You can have specialized services that are really thinking about a particular set of needs, but you can't limit if there are other people who feel like they would benefit from those. David, is there anything you'd add to that?
I think you covered most of it. I kind of just touching back on that point about benefiting from the services. As we look at project design and the project design pieces that go into spaces that are LGBT specific or really for any marginalized community, the construction of those services, the expectations on those project participants does not need to vary. And so, you know, somebody's decision to disclose being transgender or being LGBTQ, it does not impact how they may benefit from the services. If you look at the family reunification or things like that, it also doesn't in any way prohibit a project from setting expectations around behavior, around language, around the way that residents interact with each other and staff. And individuals' inability to comply with those rules are different and apart from whether they are eligible to enroll in the project and should be permitted the access to the bed, in Abby's example. And so hopefully that's a clear answer, Ben. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, so thanks. And, you know, questions are still pouring in, and thank you all for sharing these. We will try and pass these along as well and see if we can, if David or Abby have any time to answer some of these and post these later. But I do want to give you all a chance to get on with the other stuff that you've prepared, and we'll take some more questions as they keep coming in. So keep sending those in. But so I'm not sure who's picking back up again, but let's jump back into the slides.
Yep. We'll move right back in. And as I mentioned at the beginning, folks really need to hear individually that we hear them and we get it. And so I put this slide together so that it was really clear, is my project required to comply with the equal access rule? And so one of the questions that we get asked often is, I am a COC-funded domestic violence shelter and only serve women and children. Does the HUD equal access rule apply? The answer is yes, it does. So HUD's definition of family is focused on household composition. And if you want the official and formal language around that, you can Google FAQ 1529. I use that a lot. And that talks about that households that present for service need to be served as households. And so it's fine to say we serve domestic violence survivors, but if you are using HUD funds to serve domestic violence survivors and their children, then we have to serve, using those federal resources, we have to serve at that project all survivors of domestic violence. And so that includes households that are headed by men that are survivors of domestic violence. And so that's one of those questions that comes up, that folks generally think we don't understand the nuance or the complexity. It is nuanced, it is complex, and many projects have had to examine how they operate. But it was critically important to HUD to get this right, and that's why they worked at it initially when the rule was being rolled out with the TA materials. We worked with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and many local DV projects to look at how this played out. But fundamentally, the answer is yes. The next question: I operate a COC-funded homeless shelter that only serves women and children. Does the HUD equal access rule apply? Yes, it does. There is not a constellation or a program that permits the service of just women and children. Unfortunately, what we've seen in some projects is even identifying a particular age that a boy must exit the project, which was really disheartening and surprising to discover. That any male child over the age of 13 had to leave the project or the household lost their slot. And that's a violation of several rules. Involuntary family separation in HUD shelters is not something that's permitted by the interim rule. And discriminating against a household based on the gender of a child is also not permitted. And so if you're using those resources to fund the project, you cannot establish that kind of criteria. I operate an SRO for homeless men. Does the HUD equal access rule apply to me? And this one has come up in a few different ways recently. One, I got a question from a state about the definition of single, and that they misunderstood the program requirement to mean single as a marital status as opposed to single as the quantity of people in the household. And they had been enforcing a requirement that individuals be unmarried. And that's not permissible. The rule itself says you can't discriminate on marital status. And in fact, an SRO does not meet the standard for, or I should say most SROs, it might be the rare exception, none I've encountered yet, meet the standard to permit a single-sex environment. And therefore, establishing a criteria that said an SRO was only for men would be a tough standard to meet. In general, we've seen in many communities, lots of communities examining their expectations around SROs in general. So I don't want to, I know I'm running out of time here, so I do want to kind of move this along, and so Ben, maybe you can pop through the other questions as we go. Just to be clear, they all, the answer is yes. In all of these situations, the equal access rule does apply. Moving us on, I wanted to just touch base on what discrimination looks like. Sometimes as staff, we don't recognize discrimination when it happens, or we don't have the a good plan to meet it when something occurs. And so I put together a few points here on where how discrimination occurs in CPD projects around the country, because I think it's helpful to understand what happens. Over enforcement of the rules is a big component, that the rules get enforced. I think this is something that happens in projects, that rules get enforced differently for different populations or different people. Households being excluded, or complaints by individuals who are LGBT not being addressed in the same way that they would be from an individual who was not a member of that community. Abby talked about at the beginning our coordinated, the research that came out around call centers. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll see, a call center operator that hangs up on a person once the caller is identified as transgender. And this is a particularly tough way, because individuals who are excluded from the system as a whole may not even show up as having been discriminated against. And so it's really important, and Abby's the expert on coordinating the entry systems, it's really important that projects have a good handle on who is not even entering the system, and how people are being excluded right at the beginning. I talked a lot about all of these other components. The last one is about comfort, and we've talked about that as well. So Ben, maybe you could launch our next poll.
Yeah, absolutely. So you will see this poll pop up here in just a second. It's going to ask about whether these are things that you have seen in your projects or not. So give me 1 second and you'll see it. All right, you should be seeing it now. About a quarter of you have voted already, so I'll give you about 20 more seconds to put in your answer. All right, about 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and we'll see the answers in just a second.
This is interesting, huh? This is great. Thanks, Ben, so much for loading all these polls into the presentation. I really appreciate it. So it looks like for about a quarter of you, these issues don't, your sense is these have not come up in the project or community. And for just over a third of you, these issues have come up but aren't being managed well. And just under half of you, these issues have come up and are managed with equal access. And so I think those first two categories are really interesting to me. I often, as we look at enforcement of things like the equal access rule or discrimination in general, often when a community makes a big initial change, they see a surge in complaints as individuals are able to access and seek redress for the first time, that those counts go up. And so, and then for that group that the issues have come up but are not managed well, I just really want to drive home that you can absolutely request technical assistance. If there are concerns, your COC's written standards should have mechanisms within them to deal with any issues that come up. And your HUD field offices and HUD headquarters also have mechanisms, and we'll talk a little bit about those as we go. But it is also great to see that almost half of you indicate these are being managed well. Thanks so much, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you all have some scenarios coming up, and I want to make sure we get to those. I did just want to pose one question real quick that came in that I think is relevant to what you just spoke on. So you talked about, programs that are funded by HUD needing to follow the equal access rule. I know a lot of shelters, a lot of providers are braiding different kinds of funding, some that may be coming from HUD, some that may be coming from, either local government grants or private dollars, whatever that may be. Are those folks required to follow the HUD equal access rule with all of their programming, or just the programming that's funded by HUD?
Abby, do you want to tackle that? Or
yeah, and I wish I could give you a simple answer. This is not going to be simple, but bear with me. So it sounds like parts of a larger program with perhaps multiple projects under it have a lot of funding. Some of them have HUD funding, others don't, right, Ben?
Correct.
Okay. So obviously the parts that get HUD funding, it's clear cut. I think part of what I'm going to say is it depends. It depends on how this programming is set up. But there's one other factor that I want to put in the mix here, which is that the equal access rule and the gender identity rule are speaking specifically to HUD-funded programs. There are also always questions of whether something is violating federal civil rights laws, including the Fair Housing Act. And the Fair Housing Act applies to all dwellings, regardless of whether something has HUD funding or not. So if you think about the Fair Housing Act is something that was passed by Congress. HUD happens to be the enforcement agency for it, but it's not about enforcing it for HUD-funded programs. The fact that we are the enforcement agency is not tied to our funding. What it means is that the Fair Housing Act applies to all dwellings, regardless. And where I will have to again say it depends is that shelters fall in a funny place where they may or may not be dwellings. And it depends on a lot of different factors. I am not a fair housing lawyer. And so that's really as far as I can say, with any level of confidence. Oftentimes, the only time you know whether you're a dwelling or not is if you have a Fair Housing Act complaint leveled against you, and then there's an investigation done to determine whether you're a dwelling or not, and whether you would fall under the Fair Housing Act. So it is a complicated landscape. In general, I would say, if you just admit people who come to your front door, you'll generally stay out of these complicated situations. But to the extent that you have other impinging factors, I just offer those couple things to you.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I think I'll stop at that, and so you can make sure we get time to dive into a few of these scenarios. So I'll pull aside a couple other questions for at the end, but I wanted to kick those over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Ben. So looking at our first scenario, and again, we like to talk in specifics here because we know that's kind of what's most helpful for you. So we have lots of projects that are housed in facilities that are not designed to be shelters, like a 50-bed, in this example, a 50-bed old firehouse that has congregate sleeping and bathroom facilities with no privacy for any client. One of the men staying at the shelter comes to a volunteer staff person and identifies as transgender. Do I allow them to continue using the same facilities as other clients? And Ben is an excellent prompt there. not only can you allow it, but are required to do so. These projects are not permitted to isolate clients based on their transgender status, though a client may request an accommodation. In this case, a reasonable accommodation from my perspective would be if this person felt a particular risk, is to say, can I sleep in the bed that's near the staff workstation? But these are different. A client requesting an accommodation is different from staff making a judgment and requiring the client to accept an accommodation. At that point, it crosses into from a request to a requirement, and that's when it becomes potentially discriminatory. One of the strategies that projects use in scenarios like this is to describe a particular type of client that is highly vulnerable and create spaces that any client that meets those thresholds can access. And there are lots of factors that go into being highly vulnerable. For homeless transgender individuals, they're much more likely to be the victim of a crime, a violent assault, than they are to be any kind of threat to anybody else in the project. There are other populations that have similar risk profiles. Individuals who are homeless and elderly, individuals who are homeless and very young, individuals who are disabled. And so as we look at how vulnerability expresses itself inside particular beds and making them available at a client's request and letting a client know they're available is an excellent strategy to balance these different elements. Fundamentally, treating all clients who are eligible with all of the same services is really at the heart of every answer that we will give. Thanks, Ben. You can move us on. So scenario 2, if I ran a domestic violence project that only serves women, housing residents in 2 separate buildings on the same property. All residents have access to the same services, but I've decided to house women who identify as transgender in one building and women who do not in the other. I did this because I'm worried about triggering traumatic experiences for residents of the project as they begin to rebuild their lives. Can I require all women who identify as transgender be served in a different building or project? And I think at the heart of this question is a desire to be effective and a desire to be supportive. And we wrote this question in a way, there is a desire to serve everybody in a project that creates the atmosphere, the program that will help them to recover and move out of homelessness as quickly as possible. In this case, though, creating a separate building and requiring all individuals who identify as transgender is segregating. It's separate but equal, and we don't have a great history of delivering services in that model. And so this question also has come up repeatedly in projects when I've done training, is how do we address that idea of discomfort and not that one individual's genuine discomfort and sense of being threatened or at risk is separate and apart from another individual's actual threat to that person. And so particularly within the dimension of domestic violence, individuals who encounter other people who share attributes with the person who assaulted them trigger real, genuine anxiety, trauma, all of those factors that inhibit their functioning. And those elements of reactions have to be engaged with the same authentic and supportive services as anyone else's authentic needs. And so designing projects that have trauma-informed care as a perspective on this work, designing projects in a way that supports staff with the skills and expertise to engage in those moments and figure out how to navigate that, because as we all know, individuals who are homeless, we need to be supplying the resources and the skills to move out of homelessness. Self-sufficiency is a goal, housing first is our goal, and so how to support that at every step in the process is critically important. Abby, is there anything you want to add to that before we move on?
I have no content, but the thing I would say is we have worked closely with the DV advocacy community in creating materials and guidance, and the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence both have put out some really good materials speaking specifically to victim service providers about this issue. So I just point you to both of those organizations and their resources as a place to find more information.
Thanks so much. So Ben, if you'd rather hold questions or dive in, let me know what you'd prefer.
Yeah, so I actually think that what you have coming up is going to be relevant to a couple of the questions. So there's some questions coming in about, like, what do we do if there are programs in our community that aren't following equal access? What is kind of the process for addressing that? And I believe you have some resources like that coming up. So I think if you're okay with it, let's just keep going through your slides, and I think that will address some of the questions that are coming in.
Sounds good. Great. So just to check in with folks, I want to look at this question just to make sure it's really clear. If you operate a project using HUD funds that serves women and children, do I need to serve men with children? And I think this will be our last poll, but it's an important one.
That's quick. I see about a third of you have responded. Leave this open for just about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it.
So about 94% of you got that one right. Yes, the answer is yes. If you operate a project with HUD funds that serves women and children, you must also serve men with children. The program model is families and not women and children. So looking at next steps and where do we go from here? Oh, sorry, knowledge check. I forgot. Thanks, Ben. Sorry about that. I jumped just too far ahead. This basically is the more formal language of everything I just said. So if minor children, if you serve households with minor children, you must serve all households with minor children. You can decide as a project that you are only going to serve households with minor children, and say to a household that presents, and this comes up where we have an adult child and a parent come for shelter to a family shelter, you could absolutely set a requirement that says we only serve households with minor children and exclude those comprised entirely of adults. So next steps, for frontline staff, I think one of the most important things that you can look to is an anti-discrimination policy, and that is passed at the board of directors level or senior management level and should be posted publicly. If it's not, if you don't know if your organization has an anti-discrimination policy, that's a problem. And so if you're a frontline staffer and you're unsure, ask your managers and directors or directors where it is and what it is. And as Abby mentioned at the beginning, HUD-funded projects are required to update their policies and procedures and incorporate this into that. And anti-discrimination policy language is one of the main places we see that language reflected inside the project. And there's a great link here if you need it. Similar, if you're a site director or a site manager, knowing if you have an anti-discrimination policy, how is that conveyed to staff and volunteers? Sometimes folks say, well, we have volunteers and I'm not really comfortable, talking about this, or can we really hold them to the same standard? And the answer is yes, that really by granting an individual person access to your site, you are responsible for how that person conducts themselves. And if we are setting a standard in the community within the shelter, everybody who's granted access to that site, to that community, has to adhere to the same standards. Ben mentioned there are some great resources, handouts attached to this, and hopefully you'll find those on NEH's website soon as well. And really, for COC leaders, looking at how projects are in alignment with the COC written standards and policies and how those policies are being enforced, how would you as a COC know how do you know the policies are being enforced? What metrics do you have in place, both to detect a positive outcome, i.e. the policies are enforced and we're not discriminating, or a negative one? And so needing metrics on both sides of that threshold to understand how these policies are being applied. And particularly on this topic, this can be complicated. This can involve lawyers that need to sign off on policies. And so how do you as a COC work collaboratively across organizations to develop a policy, maybe train staff jointly on a regular basis, and use consistent metrics across the portfolio of services to support that? And being 100% clear, projects must comply. These are not optional. These are part of your grant agreement. These are for projects that want to be UFAs. These are, you're going to need to be able to monitor to these things. This is critically important. As I mentioned, where to begin that anti-discrimination policy, looking to that language. Does it include gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation in the list of protected attributes? And do you, as staff of volunteers or contractors, are you trained on this? Do you feel like you have the resources you need to do this respectfully, to engage in when you see harassment happening or you see discrimination happening? How do you intervene in that situation? And ideally, the COC is supporting all of the projects in a jurisdiction, developing those skills. But we ask a lot of the COC, and folks in my role and in Abby's role are acutely aware of that. And so looking at where to begin, you also have access to other resources. And there are other folks in your community, like fair housing enforcement agencies, like equality federations, like human rights commissions. There are lots and lots of different folks who are focused on this issue, who have expertise in this issue, and who are more than happy to engage with you. So we put up 2 examples here, but these are by no means an exhaustive list of who's available to you as a resource. And I would really encourage you to find other resources, because as we all know, the bandwidth of the COC and the bandwidth at our projects is 110% full all of the time. Who can I ask for help? So ultimately, HUD absolutely is positioned to support you. And there are a couple of ways you can access that support. One is the LGBT homeless resource page on the HUD Exchange. And we've highlighted a couple of things there with these links for people who are in crisis. What are some outreach services, some national call centers that people who are in crisis can call at any moment, 24/7, 365? And then if you are concerned that you are witnessing a violation, or that your community is not moving in a direction of compliance, or that a project is really circumventing a lot of these mechanisms, anyone can report a violation. And there's a link there to do so on the internet, and there's a phone number to do so. And Abby, as you look at where to file a complaint, could you talk a little bit about what happens when somebody files a complaint on the gender identity co-access rule?
Sure. So there are a couple ways that you can file a complaint. For those of you who are in contact with or familiar with your CPD field office, we're the owners of the gender identity rule, meaning CPD is going to be processing those complaints, and we're going to do it like we do with other findings, where somebody's found to be out of compliance with a requirement. We're going to put a corrective plan in place and set a timeline and give TA if we need to help somebody resolve the non-compliance. You also, because of the overlapping nature of what we're talking about, you also can file a Fair Housing Act complaint. And that's, as I talked about before, Fair Housing Act complaints apply to all dwellings regardless of funding. And, you know, they have a different investigation process that they go through, but we are always trying within HUD, despite, you know, having our own books of work in the different offices, we try to talk with each other and whenever these complaints come in to make sure that we're tackling it in the best way possible. So then just put up, where can I file a complaint? You can file a complaint that is about gender identity or sexual orientation. The part about where the evidence establishes that the discrimination is based on sex stereotyping, that is what our fair housing folks are trained to do. They're going to work to figure that out. So if you are seeing instances of discrimination because of somebody's gender or sexual orientation, then it's fully appropriate to file a complaint. And what I mean by that is that it's not on you to figure out whether it's based on sex stereotyping, but that language is important for the sort of investigation that occurs.
So Ben, as I mentioned, we have a lot of slides appended to the end here as, for folks to have moving forward. So that kind of brings us to the end of our formal presentation. If there are other questions, we're happy to answer them.
And David, I think the other thing I'd mention at this point, though we did not put a link up, the Ask a Question desk continues to be one of the best places where you can get a written response to the issue. And it just so happens that it's David and me and two other folks who are answering those questions. And I think, you know, when they come in and they are a bit more complex or nuanced, David referenced one earlier about the SROs, we call and try to figure it out. And that often can become a gateway to doing some more work with a particular community or a particular project to figure out how to make these requirements, how to enact these requirements in your community. So I'd very much encourage you to use that. And it looks like Ben is flipping through some of our resource slides.
Yeah, so I recognize this is going pretty quickly, but again, these are all resources you have on the right-hand side of your screen under handouts. You have some of the resources that I mentioned at the top of the webinar, like some training scenarios and other things. Each of these, I want to flash them up here on the screen now so that you can see them, but you have this entire slide deck available over there in handouts as well so that you can actually see these and take the time to read them. A lot of this stuff is a lot more in-depth information that's hopefully helpful, but is not going to be applicable maybe to all of you. So just want you to have this, have access to it so that you can see it. But with that, I'm going to see if there are any final questions coming in. We're bumping up against 3:30 when we said we would have you all out of here. Honestly, I think so. There's a million questions we could pick from, but I think I would just turn it back to you, David and Abby. What if there was just one thing that you could leave each of us with as sort of a key takeaway of what you would hope, if you could kind of distill the essence of equal access down to one phrase or one sentence, what would it be? What do you want folks to walk away with today?
Ben, I think
serving people. Go ahead, Abby.
What's that?
No, I said for me, it's about serving people. You serve the person in front of you. I spent the last 2 days at a 500-bed emergency shelter, and seeing the empathy and the communication and the value that the frontline staff have approached their work, and the way that the supervisors and project designers have supported that to make sure that they have the tools to serve the people who need the help is amazing. But it all starts from a place of service and helping the person in front of you.
David, that is very much what I would say. I'll say a bit more on that. We are in the business of working for people who have had every other social safety net, practically most of the time, failed them. And everyone who walks through the door of our projects and any projects we've ever worked in is facing a mountain of issues. And they have a history of where they came from and what they've endured before they walk through our doors. I think that it is our responsibility, and I'm using our because I think we collectively move through positions of frontline decision-making, policy-making, but we're in the same project here of ending homelessness, and not knowing what people have endured before they walk through the doors of wherever it is that we're working, that's our responsibility to show up with respect and value of the human beings that are there who need the thing that we have the good fortune and privilege of offering.
Thank you so much, David and Abby. I think those are powerful words to walk away with that remind us why this is important, not just because it's a bunch of rules and that our money depends on it, even though that can also be true, but because it is really about making sure that we're serving folks who are experiencing homelessness, and that includes a wide variety of people, and we want to make sure that our programs can serve all of them. So thank you both so much for joining us, and thanks to all 400 of you who have stuck it out through to the end of this call. We greatly appreciate your time. If you look in the chat box, I'm gonna once I stop. Once I say goodbye, I'm going to leave this open just for a little bit. Refer down to the chat box. Download the handouts that you want. I did put links to a couple of the things that you could click on in the slides. I know you're not always able to click on them through the webinar software, so I put links to a couple of the resources that David and Abby mentioned, as well as the HUD Ask a Question exchange, which, as you heard from David and Abby, is a great way to reach them if you have more specific questions as well. So all of those things are there in the chat box. So with that, I will just thank you all again for joining us, and thank you so much to David and Abby for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us today. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.